Show of hands, how many of you are watching this at work? If you are, good for you. Steal back some of that time. But as this episode will explain, there's an increasing likelihood that you're not watching this at work. Because you told your boss to pound sand, changed all the work displays to Big Chungus, and pulled the fire alarm on your way out, never to return. In this episode, we're going to take a look at the recent massive wave of resignations, why it's happening, and the state of the US labor market as a whole. Okay, time for a quick refresher in case any of you were off the grid for the last couple years. If you were, lucky you. In early 2020, we got a new plague. Things got bad pretty quickly, and countries around the world developed their own strategies for overcoming this viral challenge. Some countries chose to do it the right way. Lockdowns, mass testing, common sense precautions, delivering food and supplies to people, and so on. Others decided to sacrifice their population on the altar of capitalism so that a handful of ultra-rich vampires could buy a smaller yacht to ferry them to and from their mega yacht. I'm not joking. For the next 2 years, American workers were put through the ringer. They were called essential workers, applauded, and thanked profusely for their service. Unfortunately, applause and boats doing donuts do not inoculate essential workers against a deadly virus, and as a result of being required to work to survive, hundreds of thousands of them did not. The stress of working in these conditions was overwhelming, and millions of Americans decided they were not going to die for their bosses. Resignations went through the roof, far exceeding any numbers on record. Then, when the CDC flipped a switch and made COVID not bad anymore because corporations got grumpy, those same workers were cast aside and derided as low skill, despite being literally the only thing keeping the economy running during the pandemic. As you might imagine, people were shocked and upset at this abrupt change, and the resignations continued. 2 years, or in American terms, nearly 1 million lives from the start of the pandemic, and we're currently seeing an average of nearly 4,000 COVID deaths a day in the United States. A 9/11's worth of deaths every single day, and our government is pretending it's not happening, that the pandemic is over, that everything is back to normal. More and more Americans are coming to grips with the fact that this is not the case, and that our leaders have chosen the almighty economy over the lives of our friends, our family, and our co-workers. So, that brings us up to speed. Depressed yet? Hang in there. I've got some concrete suggestions at the end. Now, it's pretty obvious that working during a pandemic can lead to some suboptimal conditions, and it makes perfect sense that many people would rather quit than risk dying. But resignation numbers have been steadily increasing for a long time. In fact, with just one exception during the Great Recession, resignation rates have been on the rise for the entire 20 years it's been tracked. Why is that? The obvious answer, and the one you've no doubt heard on this channel before, is that work is simply getting worse in every conceivable way. Wages have stagnated and are nowhere close to keeping up with inflation or the skyrocketing cost of living. Vacation days and sick days are a thing of the past. Parental leave is non-existent. Pensions have vanished. You're expected to be on call at all hours. Your manager can text you on your day off and demand you come in and cover the shift of a sick coworker. Even the fabled upward mobility once you're hired is no longer possible in most scenarios. This is all stuff that our parents and grandparents took for granted. And as the disease of capitalism has progressed into its later stages, those job benefits have been consumed by the never-ending search for greater corporate profits. The job market today is nothing like it was in, say, 2000. And if the older people lambasting the youth for their laziness and entitlement would just take a few days and apply for a handful of jobs online, I think they'd realize just how different everything is from when they were in their prime working years. But there's another aspect of work under capitalism that is equally important to understand. Let's talk about alienation. In the not-so-distant past, human beings, at least a portion of the population, had relative autonomy and control of their lives. Merchants and craftspeople owned what are called the means of production. The carpenter had control of his woodworking process from beginning to end. He made his own furniture, and he owned the finished product until he sold it to someone else. The bootmaker made a pair of boots, and they were his. The product of his labor belonged to him. As capitalism developed, this began to change. Factories were built, and they needed labor. As poor workers flocked to the cities from the countryside, they took their places along the production chain, and in exchange for a wage, they traded their autonomy, their agency, and became just one cog in a much larger machine, fracturing the work that used to be done by one person or a small team into many different hyper-specialized pieces so that now, no single worker could say they were a bootmaker or a furniture maker. They just did one small thing, day in and day out. In this new arrangement, a tiny handful of people, the capitalists, owned the means of production, or the means by which goods were produced. The workers, without the means of production, were left with only one thing to sell: their own labor. That same arrangement persists to this day, and the psychological effects are the same. Workers become alienated from themselves and their own autonomy and dignity, from their fellow human beings, and from the product of their labor. Let's take a quick look at all three. First, alienation from the self. When you go to work for the capitalist, when you surrender your autonomy and become a cog in their machine, you experience a distinct loss of control over your own destiny and sense of self. The things you produce are no longer an act of self-expression, as a fine pair of boots was to the bootmaker, but rather an endlessly repeated task that is dictated to you by someone else. For the vast majority of people, your job has nothing whatsoever to do with your goals, your desires, what you want to do with your life. It's simply a way to make sure you don't starve, that you can keep a roof over your head and pay your bills. In a sense, this alienation from the self reduces human beings to little more than animals, acting only out of the direct need for self-preservation, that very most basic need. Second, alienation from other people and society at large. Once you accept the capitalist conception of society, the traditional and natural view of other human beings as friends and community is destroyed. Each other person becomes a threat, a challenge to be overcome. What if they take your job? What if they get the promotion and you don't? What if they're willing to work for less money? This fear, caused entirely by a system that pits humans against one another for advancement and even mere survival, causes intense feelings of separation, of being apart from other human beings. And for far too many people, it becomes accepted as normal, as the way things are. Third, alienation from the product of your labor. In a capitalist society, for 99% of the population, what you produce does not belong to you. You sell your labor in exchange for a wage, and whatever you produce during the hours you've sold becomes the property of the capitalist. That property is then sold, netting the capitalist a healthy profit. In stark contrast to workers owning the means of production, the bootmaker, for example, the products workers produce under capitalism do not benefit the worker at all. In fact, they become yet another challenge to overcome. Whereas the bootmaker can make a pair of boots, and then they are his to do with whatever he likes, wear them or sell them, workers in a factory may produce 100 TVs a day and own none of them. They would have to pay the money they receive in their wage to buy the very thing that they have produced with their labor. That's alienation in a nutshell, and it's an essential feature of capitalism. It also goes a long way towards explaining why so many people are miserable in their jobs. In a time when simply going to work could mean dying, when your existing economic precarity is made worse by a global pandemic, and when billionaires become even more massively wealthy as 1 million of your fellow human beings die, it should be very clear why so many Americans are leaving their jobs. They're beginning to understand the problem. Let's take a look at some numbers. In November of 2021, 4.5 million Americans quit their jobs. That is an enormous figure. A few months prior, in August, 4.3 million quit. Across the entirety of 2021, an average of 3.95 million workers quit every month. According to one poll, over half of Americans are looking for a new job, or simply want to leave their current one. That's not a blip. That is the beginning of something very big. The media is calling it the Great Resignation, and the New York Times, finger on the pulse as always, compared the trend to a virus, calling it a quitagion, and postulating how companies could inoculate themselves from this horrible illness. It's pretty telling that when American workers begin to show the slightest glimmer of class consciousness, the paper of note comes out crying that these normal, hardworking people are a disease to be protected against. That should tell you something about where the interests of this country lie. So, what are businesses doing in response to this surge of resignations? Well, they're obviously complaining like they always do. No one wants to work anymore, my labor shortage. But common sense would have you believe that the logic of the free market would force these companies to compete, right? To offer the best incentives in order to win over potential employees. As socialists have been trying to explain for well over a century, the logic of capitalism is exploitation, plain and simple. Extract as much value as possible by whatever means necessary. Offering benefits cuts into the bottom line. It's not immediately profitable in the short term, even though it would clearly increase hiring and retention. Their solution in this scenario? Bring back child labor. If adults won't work, let's press their kids into service. Multi-billion-dollar companies like McDonald's are now offering reduced pay positions for 14 and 15-year-olds. And trucking companies are flirting with the idea of allowing teenage drivers. To capitalists, it's the perfect plan. You get a cog in your machine for cheaper than you could before, and your new workers are even less likely to understand they're being exploited because they're literal children. Okay, before we get to the solutions, let's take a look at one last problem. A few months ago, CNBC put out a video on this same topic, and in that video, they suggested there are 3 ways to improve your work life. Individually talking to your manager about why you're not enjoying work, starting a side hustle, or looking for a new job. Here's the problem. None of those things will improve your work life. Complaining to your manager alone? You're fired, easily replaced by another desperate worker. Taking on a side hustle? You'll just end up even more burned out than before. Plus the fact that side hustle in the year of our Lord 2022 just means selling your soul to any number of gig economy scams, where you're not only paid peanuts for running yourself and your car into the ground, but you get even less protection and stability than in your current garbage job. Their third solution is simply to find another job. That seems to be the route most people are taking, but here's the issue. Low wages, unsafe working conditions, and a complete lack of benefits are par for the course across the entire US labor landscape. Odds are whatever job you find will put you right back in that terrible position. This framing is a huge problem. Just like everything under capitalism, your choices are reduced to individual responsibility. Want to solve climate change? Buy more paper straws. Want a more representative government? Just get out there and vote harder. So it shouldn't be a surprise that a capitalist mainstream news network presents your options in this intentionally limited way. But you guys are smart. You can tell that CNBC very obviously left out the only real solution to immediately improve your work experience. Well, the only one I can openly advocate for on YouTube: unionization. And fortunately, it looks like the American people as a whole are starting to catch on. The pandemic has raised the consciousness of countless Americans, with more and more workers becoming fed up with being exploited and worked to death for next to nothing. But are you ready for some really good news? In January of this year, we officially doubled the number of union certification elections filed in 2021. That is really promising. Much of this new union activity is driven by Starbucks workers. Just weeks after the first corporate Starbucks store unionized in Buffalo, New York, 54 more stores in 19 states have filed for their own union elections. Starbucks, like other massive corporations, has gone on the record to say that they don't need a union. It'll just get in the way of running a smooth operation and make things harder for the workers. We're all just one big happy team anyway. Do you really want to bring on a union and make us sad? Won't you think of your executives' feelings? Of course, this is just a slimy union-busting tactic. These companies are desperate not to have to deal with unionization, because unions, unlike individual workers, actually have bargaining power. Ask any union worker what happened after their store unionized. Depending on the industry, it's not unheard of to see wages double after unionization. It's no wonder corporations don't want it to happen, because that will cut into their unconscionable tens of millions of dollars in executive salaries. Those executives don't produce value, their workers do. And with a union, those workers can get more of the money they deserve and far better treatment than what they're suffering without union representation. You've probably all seen this meme. It's funny, but it's at least partly accurate. A loan, and with the mindset induced by life under capitalism, you are powerless. You will never gain an inch of ground against corporate interests. But with collective action, you can hit them where it hurts, right in the wallet. Now, I said I'd have concrete actions for you to take, and I do. Here's how you can help raise class consciousness and revitalize the American labor movement. First, if you are currently employed and your job isn't unionized, you can reach out to established organizations like the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World. They've got a form on their website where you can provide a little info and get in touch with expert organizers who can help you unionize your workplace. If you're not employed, or if your job is unionized, you can still help this process by handing out pamphlets or other information in the stores you visit. Just be subtle about it. You don't want to get the employees in trouble. The IWW has a variety of documents you can print out and distribute to those who would like to learn more about what it means to be part of a union. And the IWW isn't the only one. Plenty of industries have specific unions for workers in that field. A quick search online will get you the info relevant to you or your area. You don't have to limit your agitating to your local stores either. You can distribute literature and resources online. Anywhere there are disgruntled workers, there's room for you to make a positive difference. For those who have a knack for the visual arts, consider making flyers for your local organizing groups, unions, or Socialist Party chapters. If you have a social media presence, use your voice to help educate people and raise class consciousness. It may all be old news to you, but there are so many people out there who have never heard this stuff. And if you can make an impact on one person, they may go on to win over other people. It's a collective effort, and we all have a role to play. Millions of workers are quitting their jobs, but if we don't seize the day and help explain why work under capitalism is terrible, this new movement will fizzle out, because people still have to feed their families, and labor under capitalism is the only game in town. It is our responsibility as organizers, educators, and decent human beings to help our fellow workers understand the root cause of their problems, and to work towards a future where the means of production are controlled by the many, not the few. Building this new labor movement is a step in the right direction.